For 72 hours, the commanders in Moscow didn't just think they were winning, they were already celebrating. The maps on Putin's desk showed a sea of red engulfing the critical logistics hub of Kupiansk. The reports were unanimous: the Ukrainian lines had shattered, the defenders were fleeing, and the gateway to the Kharkov region was wide open. But what looked like a rout was actually the most dangerous thing in modern warfare: a perfectly engineered mirage. They were walking into a kill box designed months in advance. Of confidence in the Russian sector was palpable. Heavy mechanized brigades had spent weeks softening up the perimeter. To the naked eye, and even to the drone operators hovering above, it appeared that the Ukrainian resistance had finally snapped under the relentless pressure of artillery barrages and glide bomb strikes. Russian state media had begun to prepare the narrative of a decisive breakthrough, one that would redeem the stagnation of the previous months. Tanks rolled forward with hatches open. Infantry moved in administrative columns, other than combat formations, and supply trucks packed with ammunition followed close behind, assuming the roads were secure. This assumption of safety was the first fatal error. The Russian command believed that their sheer volume of fire had pulverized the opposition. They saw abandoned trenches and silence, and they interpreted it as capitulation. Intelligence reports suggesting that Ukraine was rotating troops out of the sector were misconstrued as a retreat. In reality, the Ukrainian command had not withdrawn. They had simply gone dark. They had pulled their heavy armor back into the tree lines, camouflaged under thermal blankets, and dispersed their infantry into hardened, hidden basements, waiting for the enemy to overextend. The geography of Kupiansk is unforgiving. It is a network of roads and rails that dictates the flow of supplies for the entire Eastern Front. By allowing Russian forces to push deep into the outskirts, Ukraine was essentially inviting a massive traffic jam of Russian armor into a confined space. The deeper the Russians pushed, the longer their supply line stretched, and the more exposed their flanks became. It was a classic defense-in-depth strategy, but played with such high stakes that even Western analysts were holding their breath. As the sun set on that third day, the Russian vanguard was radioing back success. They had captured key intersections. They were setting up forward operating bases and buildings that had been pre-sighted by Ukrainian artillery weeks ago. The illusion was complete. The Russian generals thought they were looking at a map of conquest, but they were actually looking at the coordinates of their own destruction. The silence that hung over the battlefield wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the deep breath before the scream. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and the jaws were about to snap shut. It didn't start with a bang, but with a blackout. At 3 o'clock hours, every Russian radio frequency in the sector suddenly drowned in static. Electronic warfare systems, hidden until this exact moment, blinded the Russian coordination. And then, the sky fell. It wasn't just artillery, it was a synchronized symphony of destruction from 3 different directions, targeting the exact coordinates where the Russians had felt safest. The chaos was instantaneous and absolute. The Russian armored columns, which had packed tightly together on the narrow roads of Kupiansk, suddenly found themselves trapped in a burning cage. The first strikes were surgical precision. HIMARS rockets slammed into the rear of the convoy and the front, destroying the engineering vehicles and trapping the tanks in the middle. There was nowhere to turn, nowhere to maneuver. The very roads they had used to rush toward victory had become the parking lot of burning steel. Simultaneously, the retreating Ukrainian forces reappeared. The empty trenches on the flanks suddenly erupted with anti-tank fire. Javelin and LAW teams, who had been lying in wait for days with incredible discipline, began picking off the lead tanks. The Russian crews, disoriented by the loss of communications and the suddenness of the assault, panicked, spun wildly, searching for targets that were invisible in the dense tree lines. Friendly fire incidents spiked as confused Russian units fired on their own retreating comrades in the darkness. What made this counterattack devastating was the use of drone swarms. While heavy artillery pounded the static columns, thousands of FPV first-person view drones buzzed out of the ruins of Kupiansk. They didn't go for the heavy armor, they went for the soft targets, the fuel trucks and the troop transports. Within an hour, the night was illuminated by the towering infernos of burning fuel. The Russian logistical spine, which had followed the tank so confidently, was snapped in half. The psychological impact was even more damaging than the physical losses. The Russian soldiers, who hours ago believed they were conquerors, now realized they were surrounded. The narrative of victory collapsed in seconds, replaced by the primal terror of encirclement. Commanders shouted orders into dead radios. Reinforcements, rushing to help, were hit by cluster munitions deployed to deny access to the kill zone. The trap was not just about killing the enemy, it was about breaking their will. The sheer violence of the reversal, going from total control to total chaos in under an hour, shattered the morale of some of Russia's most elite units. They weren't fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting for their lives, scrambling over the wreckage of their own machines to escape a city that had promised them glory but delivered only fire. As the smoke cleared over Kupiansk, the true scale of the disaster became visible from space. It wasn't just a battlefield defeat, it was a graveyard of modern equipment and a black eye for the Kremlin that no propaganda could hide. The map that Putin had looked at with hope had been redrawn in blood and ash, proving once again that in this war, premature celebration is the deadliest sin of all. The aftermath of the Kupiansk engagement sent shockwaves all the way to Moscow. The drone footage that emerged the next morning showed a highway of death reminiscent of historical blunders. Dozens of T-90s and T-80s, the pride of the Russian army, sat abandoned or turretless. But the material cost, while staggering, estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, was secondary to the strategic collapse. By committing so many reserves to this sure win, Russia had thinned its lines elsewhere, leaving other sectors vulnerable. This tactical masterstroke by Ukraine forced the Russian high command into a humiliated retreat. They didn't just lose the ground they had taken in the last few days. They were pushed back further than their original starting lines. The buffer zone they hoped to create to protect their supply routes vanished, putting their own rear logistics back within range of Ukrainian artillery. The political fallout was immediate. The narrative of the unstoppable offensive was shattered. In the halls of the Kremlin, the mood shifted from triumphalism to a hunt for scapegoats. Generals were rotated, blame was cast, but the damage was done. For the soldiers on the ground, the Kupiansk trap reinforced a grim reality. Nothing is as it seems. The trust in command plummeted. If they could be led into such a devastating ambush when they were told they were winning, what else was a lie? This erosion of trust is a poison that spreads slower than a bullet but kills an army just as effectively. Ultimately, the Kupiansk counter-sprung trap serves as a brutal case study in modern warfare. It demonstrated that satellite dominance and artillery superiority mean nothing without accurate intelligence and the discipline to verify it. Ukraine proved that they could trade space for time, lure a superior force into a vulnerable position, and dismantle it with precision. The Russians thought they had won it all. They thought the game was over, but they forgot that in war, the enemy gets a move too. And when Ukraine finally moved, they didn't just check the Russian advance, they flipped the entire board. The battle for Kupiansk wasn't the end of the war, but it was the end of the illusion that Russia could simply grind its way to victory without paying a terrifying price.